The February cold came early that year, the kind that settled into the bones of everything and refused to leave. It was the sort of cold that farmers in Callaway County, Missouri understood as a physical fact rather than a complaint, the kind you drove through and worked through and eventually stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a sound that never stops. Rosalind Wexler stood outside the seed dealer's building on the eastern edge of town for nearly 2 full minutes before she pushed through the door. She wasn't stalling. She was looking at her hands. 20 years of farm work had left its record there. The calluses across the base of each finger built up and broken down and built up again through seasons of fence work and equipment handling, and the thousand small tasks that farming demanded before breakfast and after dark. The permanent stain beneath the fingernails that never fully washed out, no matter what she tried, a residue of soil and engine grease that had become as much a part of her hands as the skin itself. The small scar along the right thumb from a fence wire incident in the summer of 1983 when she was 22 and had been moving too fast the way young people always move too fast until something stops them. A clean white line across the knuckle that had never fully faded. She looked at those hands for a long moment in the February cold, thinking about what she was about to do, and then she pushed through the door. The room was warm and crowded and smelled like coffee and diesel and the particular mustiness of old seed catalogs. 30 or 40 men stood in clusters around display tables, around bales of product materials, around the long counter, where two seed company representatives were working through their pitches with the practiced energy of people who knew exactly what their audience wanted to hear. The noise was constant and layered in the way of rooms where multiple conversations are happening simultaneously, laughter from one corner, mixing with a serious argument about rainfall patterns from another, and somewhere near the back, a man explaining at considerable length why last year's hybrid had underperformed in his east field versus his west field, while another man offered a completely different explanation for the same phenomenon. Nobody was going to resolve this disagreement. They rarely did. The conversation was the point. Nobody looked up when Rosalind walked in. This was not unusual. She had been farming in this county for 15 years and had attended this seed dealer event for 12 of those years, and the room had never looked up when she walked in. She had stopped noticing years ago, or had told herself she had, which was nearly the same thing. She moved through the room without stopping, past the long display tables loaded with the current season's commercial hybrids, past the glossy product posters showing perfectly uniform ears, arranged in precise rows against backgrounds of saturated green and gold, past the charts showing bushels per acre that had climbed steadily every decade for 40 years and gave no indication of stopping. All of it promised the same things: more, consistent, predictable, approved by every elevator and processor and commodity buyer within 150 miles. She walked past all of it without slowing down. She stopped at a small side table near the back of the room where someone had left out an older seed catalog, not the current season's edition, but something from several years back, its cover faded and its spine cracked from repeated opening. She picked it up and turned to a page she had already marked with a strip of torn brown paper. The variety she was looking at was listed in small print under a subcategory titled Heritage and Specialty Cultivars, which was the section most people in this room skipped entirely because nothing in it was eligible for commodity market delivery, and therefore nothing in it was relevant to how they made their living. Lower yields, irregular ear development, non-standard sugar profile, difficult to classify under our current grading systems. The listing went on to note the variety's historical distribution across the Ozark Hill country of Missouri and Arkansas, and its gradual disappearance from commercial cultivation as hybrid breeding had standardized the industry over the preceding decades. The seed dealer still carried it because there was always one or two people every few years who wanted something unusual for a garden or a small specialty plot, and the margins on specialty seed were high enough to justify a small shelf allocation. Rosalind was working through the catalog's technical notes on germination rates when she heard the footsteps stop beside her. Eldon Mabry was 61 years old and farmed 700 acres just south of the county road that divided their two properties. He was a solid, deliberate man who farmed the way most people in that part of Missouri farmed, efficiently and conservatively, with a preference for well-tested approaches over experimental ones. He was also a reasonable man in most respects, except when he encountered something that made no obvious sense to him, at which point he became the kind of person who found it very difficult to keep his thoughts internal. He had served on the co-op board for 3 years and attended every annual seed dealer event and generally knew what was worth paying attention to and what wasn't. He was carrying a coffee cup from the refreshment table on the far wall and looking at the catalog in her hands with the specific frown of a man who already knew what he was going to say, but was giving himself a moment to confirm his reasoning first. Morning, Rosalind. Morning, Eldon. He looked at the catalog, then at the marked page, then at her face, then back at the catalog as though giving it a second chance to make more sense. You're not looking at that section. She smiled faintly because there was something almost endearing about a man who could see clearly what was happening and still phrased his observation as a denial of it. I am, though. A pause. He drank some coffee. He was looking at the heritage and specialty cultivars header as though the words themselves were the problem. That's the heritage section. I know what section it is. Another pause longer this time. He set his coffee cup down on the edge of the table and folded his arms in the particular way that people fold their arms when they're about to say something they've decided they have a responsibility to say. Rosalind, that corn doesn't grade out at any elevator within 200 miles of here. You understand that, right? There's no infrastructure for it, no buyer for it. Nobody in this county is set up to handle anything that comes out of that section. He stopped for a moment, deciding something, and then continued, because he was the kind of man who finished what he started. It's not how farming works. She turned the catalog page slightly as though comparing two entries. I'll find my own way to market it, she said. Eldon looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has tried their best and must now step back and allow the natural consequences of another person's decision to proceed. He picked up his coffee cup and walked back toward the main display tables, and within 45 seconds, she heard him say something to another man nearby, and then 2 or 3 voices laughing together, not loudly, the casual kind of laughter that takes no particular pleasure in cruelty, because it doesn't see any cruelty in what it's doing. It's just the laughter of people who've encountered something impractical and are acknowledging it together. She kept reading the catalog. She ordered enough seed for 11 acres. The drive home took 20 minutes on county roads that she had driven so many thousands of times that the landscape had become automatic, something her hands navigated while her mind did other things. The fields on either side were still brown and bare under the February sky, the cover crops she and her neighbors had planted after fall harvest, lying flat and dormant under the frost waiting for spring, the way everything in farm country waited with no outward sign of impatience. Today she was more conscious of the landscape than she usually was, or conscious of it differently, the way you sometimes see a familiar room clearly after being away from it. She turned down the farm lane and parked beside the equipment shed. Through the kitchen window, she could see Darla moving around, probably starting on lunch. Her younger sister had moved back to the Wexler farm 3 years ago after a difficult divorce had closed one chapter of her life and left her uncertain about what came next. She had been useful to the farm in ways Rosalind hadn't fully known she needed. Practical, useful, not emotional. Darla was organized in a way that Rosalind was not always organized, good at tracking supplier accounts and scheduling maintenance and catching the small administrative things that fell through the cracks of a farm operation managed largely by one person. She was also a person who worried about decisions she thought were risky, which was one of the ways she and Rosalind were fundamentally different from each other. Rosalind sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. She was thinking about her grandfather. Virgil Wexler had farmed this land for 40 years before his body started to give out, in the way that farm bodies eventually give out joints worn down by decades of physical work, the accounting that physical labor eventually presents. He was a compact, quiet man who communicated in roughly half the words another person might use for the same information, and wasted almost no time on either complaints or excessive celebrations, which Rosalind had come over time to understand as a form of efficiency rather than coldness. He kept meticulous records of everything that interested him, which was most of what he observed. 6 notebooks filled with handwritten field observations, soil measurements, rainfall totals, yield comparisons by variety and season, germination rate data, and notes on particular plant characteristics that caught his attention for reasons he didn't always explain, but that always eventually turned out to be justified. When Rosalind was 14 years old on a late August evening after dinner, when the light was still good and the heat was beginning to break, at last Virgil had taken her on a walk through the experimental plot he maintained on the south slope of the back pasture. She had been through it before on previous visits, but only in the distracted way of a child following an adult registering the presence of the roses without really looking at them. Tonight he walked more slowly, and she found herself actually looking. The plot occupied maybe 2 acres on a gentle south-facing slope that got good drainage and full afternoon sun. He grew things there that he was curious about, varieties that wouldn't go into the main commercial fields because they didn't meet commodity specifications, but that interested him for reasons of observation and documentation. Some were old varieties he'd tracked down through other farmers or through university agricultural extension contacts. Some were his own selections, lines he'd been developing through patient year-over-year seed saving and selection, adjusting toward characteristics he found valuable. He stopped beside a row of sweet corn that stood out from the others around it. The stalks were slightly shorter than standard commercial corn, and the leaves had a particular dark, saturated green that caught the evening light in a way she noticed without being able to say exactly why she noticed. He reached up without hurry and pulled an ear, peeled back the husk with deliberate care, and held it toward her. "Try this." She took a bite. The sweetness hit immediately, but it was a more complex sweetness than she was used to from the commodity sweet corn her mother bought at the grocery store in summer. Rich and layered and slightly different at the back of the palate than at the front, the kind of flavor that revealed itself in stages, rather than all at once the way something well-made reveals itself. She chewed slowly. "That's good." He nodded. "It is." She looked at the row, then back at him. "Then why doesn't everyone grow it?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the experimental plot toward the main fields beyond the fence line, where the commodity corn stood tall and completely uniform in the last of the August light, field after field of it, stretching away to the tree line and beyond every stalk, the same height every ear, the same size, the product of decades of breeding toward a single set of specifications. "Because everyone's chasing yield," he said finally, "and yield is something you can measure and report and put on a chart." He was quiet again for a moment. Flavor is harder to explain to a bank. She turned that sentence over in her mind on the walk back to the house, and for weeks afterward, and then set it somewhere in her memory where it waited for 30 years, the way certain observations wait until the moment arrives when they finally make sense from the inside rather than just the outside. Virgil died when Rosalind was 31. He had farmed the South Slope until he was 74, and then spent 3 more years doing less and less until there wasn't much left to do. He left the farm to Rosalind in equal trust with her parents, with the practical understanding that she would manage the day-to-day operation. He left her 6 notebooks in a plain white envelope with her name on the front in his careful, cramped handwriting. She opened the envelope on the evening of his funeral, sitting alone in the equipment shed, while Darla slept in the house and her parents had gone back to their hotel in town. The shed was cold, and the single overhead light made a yellow circle that didn't reach the walls. She sat on an overturned crate and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a small, folded packet of seed, the kind used for hand sorting and saving, and a single piece of paper on which Virgil had written, "Don't let it disappear because no one understands its value yet." She read the sentence several times. She held the seed packet in her palm. Outside the shed, the February cold was still finishing whatever it had started, and the farm was very quiet, and she sat with the envelope for a long time without knowing what to do with what she was feeling. Then she put everything back in the envelope, tucked it into the top drawer of the old metal filing cabinet where Virgil had kept his most important papers, and she went back to the house and to bed. She didn't open it again for 4 years. The spring she finally planted the seed was the 3rd year after she had taken over full management of the operation. Her parents had gradually reduced their involvement as her father's arthritis made the physical work impossible, and her mother acknowledged that she had never really understood the operational side of things. Rosalind had spent those 3 years restructuring the finances, renegotiating supply contracts, paying down a portion of the equipment debt, and generally getting the farm into the kind of stable ground that allowed her to consider for the first time doing something that served a purpose other than immediate financial necessity. She planted the seed on 11 acres of the South Slope, the same ground Virgil had used for his experimental plot. The soil there was lighter and better drained than the heavier clay of the main fields, which suited what she had read about the variety's particular root development characteristics. She had found everything she could about it, which wasn't very much, mostly brief mentions in older agricultural extension publications, and one detailed passage in a university thesis from the early 1960s examining Ozark heritage crop cultivation. The thesis author had characterized the variety as possessing an exceptional flavor profile attributable to an unusual sugar conversion process during kernel development, and had noted its complete unsuitability for commercial commodity market delivery due to yield variability and non-standard ear characteristics. She had read that passage 3 times. The first season, the corn came up exactly as variable as everything she had read suggested it would be. The stalks ranged in height by 6 or 8 inches within a single row. The ears developed at different rates. The kernel coloration varied from pale yellow to a deep gold that was almost orange in strong light. Standing at the edge of the south slope field on a morning in early August, she could see all the reasons commercial agriculture had moved away from varieties like this one: the inefficiency, the unpredictability, the difficulty of fitting it into any existing delivery or processing system. She could also see beneath all of those reasons something she couldn't name precisely: a quality in the plants that had nothing to do with efficiency. Darla came out to look one afternoon while Rosalind was walking the rows. "It's a little strange looking," she said, not unkindly. "It's not supposed to be uniform." Darla was quiet for a moment. She looked at the varying heights, the different stages of development along a single row. She was practical in her assessments, which meant she generally said what she actually thought. "I know you believe in this," she said finally. "I just want you to be ready if the numbers don't work out the way you're hoping." Rosalind looked across the field. "The numbers never work out exactly the way you're hoping. That's true of any crop." Darla nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but willing to let the point stand, and they walked back to the house. The first harvest was modest in volume and remarkable in quality. She and Darla sat at the kitchen table that evening and ate ears from 3 different sections of the field, comparing them. Darla ate 3 ears before she said anything. Then she said, "All right, I understand why you planted it. The second season was better than the first. The third was better than the second. The plants were developing deeper root systems in the south slope soil, establishing access to moisture and nutrients in ways that were showing up in the flavor characteristics of the grain, in ways she could track year over year in her own field notes, a new notebook she had started alongside Virgil's originals. She recorded everything the way he had recorded everything: measurements and observations, and notes on what she was seeing that she couldn't quite quantify yet. The problem was simple and immovable. Beauty and difficulty occupied the same field. The corn was genuinely exceptional. It was also completely unsaleable through any channel she could find. She tried everything she could identify: a farm stand on the county road that sold modest volumes directly to local customers and to people who made a point of stopping at such places; inquiries to specialty grocery operations in larger nearby towns, which went nowhere because her volumes were too small and her operation too informal for their supplier requirements; direct outreach to restaurants in a city 60 miles distant that had built their identity around local and unusual ingredients, which produced a few promising conversations and then a few small orders and then nothing consistent. She drove sample ears to the county co-op one October afternoon, thinking that Orville Odom might know of an alternative market she hadn't considered. Orville Odom had managed the Callaway County Co-op for 11 years and was thorough and competent and thoroughly oriented toward commodity production in the way that a person becomes when they have done one thing well for a longer time in the same environment. He studied her sample ears with attention and called another employee over to look at them, which she recognized immediately as an unfavorable signal. Nobody called a second person to evaluate something for a good reason. They called a second person when they needed a witness to what was about to be an awkward conversation. Orville turned one of the ears over in both hands, examining the kernel development and the ear's overall structure. "What variety is this?" she told him. The room behind him had gone slightly quieter. "You actually planted acreage with this." 11 acres. He set the ear down. He was a careful man with his words because he had learned through experience that careless words created problems. But there was no version of what he needed to say that was going to sound like good news. "Rosalind," he said, "this isn't commercial sweet corn. It is sweet corn." He picked up another ear. You know what I mean? Processors won't take it. Commodity buyers won't take it. The elevator can't grade it properly under current standards. There's no delivery specification it fits. He set the second ear down. The fluorescent tube in the ceiling above her flickered once and steadied. She looked at him steadily. So who buys it? He set the ear down carefully, the gesture of a man who is being gentle with something that doesn't quite deserve the care but that he is extending care to anyway. Roadside stands, he said. Local markets. Maybe a few restaurants if you build those relationships carefully. He paused. Feed grade pays something. The room was not quite silent. She could feel the awareness of the other people in it, the particular heightened attention of a group of people who are pretending to go about their business while actually following a conversation they've all just decided is worth listening to. Feed grade, she said. Orville's expression was apologetic in the specific way of a person who genuinely believes they are performing a kindness rather than delivering an insult. Something in that range, yes. Your quality of corn in terms of sweetness and flavor isn't the issue. The issue is marketability through existing channels. She picked up her sample tray. She composed her face with care. Thank you for your time, she said, and she walked out. She sat in her truck in the co-op parking lot for several minutes. The radio was off. Through the windshield, she could see the elevator towers rising gray against the October sky, the physical infrastructure of commodity agriculture, enormous and utilitarian, and built entirely for the kind of corn she was not growing. Feed grade. The words repeated in her mind with the flat persistence of a sound that echoes in a concrete room. She turned the key and drove home. She didn't tell Darla about the co-op visit for several days. When she finally did at the kitchen table after dinner while the dishes were drying, Darla's expression moved through several stages in quick succession before landing on a kind of controlled fury that she was directing more at the situation than at anyone in particular. That might be the single dumbest thing I've heard this year, Darla said. Rosalind smiled just slightly. He wasn't being cruel. He was telling me what he actually believed. That doesn't make it less stupid. No, Rosalind agreed. It doesn't. But privately, the assessment had done something to her that she hadn't fully anticipated. Not damaged her conviction exactly, not broken anything she could name, but worn at something around the edges of it, the way water wears its stones slowly and without dramatic effect, but continuously. The co-op visit was an accumulation point for a mounting pressure. The months that followed were the most difficult she'd experienced since the drought year in the early 1990s, and that difficulty had been about weather and nature forces that were understandable, even when uncontrollable. This was something different. This was the difficulty of being in the right place with the right thing at a time when the world around her was entirely organized around different criteria for rightness and not knowing whether those criteria would ever change. There was also the matter of the bank. Prescott Aldrich had managed First Callaway Bank for 22 years. He was tall and deliberate in his movements and wore the same style of dark suit every weekday and chose his words with the precision of someone who had been corrected by lawyers enough times to appreciate exactness as a virtue in itself. He sat across from Rosalind in his office one April afternoon and spread a series of documents across the desk between them with the particular deliberateness of a man who wants you to understand clearly that he has done his homework before this meeting. The farm carried a mortgage note of $180,000 against the main property and the primary equipment. The terms were standard for agricultural operations of this size in the county, and the rate was reasonable by the standards of the period. But the note came up for annual review, and the review was now 4 months away, and Prescott had called this meeting because he believed in preparing people for difficult conversations in advance. He placed his finger on a line of figures in one of the documents. I need you to understand our position here, Rosalind. If the South acreage continues to show below standard commercial returns, I can't recommend renewal to the board on the current terms. He paused. That's not a personal judgment. It's arithmetic. She looked at the figures on the page. Who decides what I plant? He smiled carefully, the smile of a man who understood the question was not really about planting. Nobody. You farm your land however you choose. She waited. But I do decide which loans I recommend for renewal, he said. That's simply the structure of how this works. She drove home from that meeting and sat in the equipment shed for 20 minutes before going inside. The fluorescent light in there buzzed faintly at one end, a sound she'd been meaning to address for 3 years without ever quite getting to it. She sat on an overturned crate and looked at the buzzing light, and thought about what Prescott had said. The language was polished, but the meaning was plain. Change what you're growing or find a different bank, and finding a different bank in Callaway County meant driving 40 miles to the next county and accepting terms that would not be better. She got up and opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet. She took out the envelope without opening it, held it in both hands for a moment with the buzzing fluorescent and the February cold around her. The paper was soft from years in the drawer and from the small number of times each year when she took it out and held it without opening it, which was a thing she did and never mentioned to anyone. Then she put it back and closed the drawer and went inside to make dinner. The fourth planting season came. She planted again. The same acreage, the same variety, because she had made a decision, and she was not the kind of person who reversed decisions midway through based on discomfort. She expanded the farm stand operation, began driving farther afield to specialty grocers, built 2 more restaurant relationships that produced modest, consistent orders, and maintained detailed records of every sale and every contact. The income from the corn was positive, but thin, nowhere near sufficient to change the numbers that Prescott Aldrich was looking at. One September evening, Arvilla Tull came through the gap in the fence between her property and the Wexler farm, the way she had done periodically since Rosalind was a girl. Arvilla was 72 and had worked the adjacent land alongside her husband for 30 years before his death had left her managing the property alone. She had sold the tillable acres, eventually keeping only the house and the kitchen garden and the woodlot on the north side. She was spare and steady in the way of people who have reduced a large life down to its essential things and found the reduction clarifying. She stopped at the edge of the south slope and looked out at the corn in the September evening light. The irregular stalks caught the low sun in a way that made the field look just briefly like something from another time. "I know this corn," Arvilla said. Rosalind turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "My mother grew something very much like this when I was small." She was quiet for a moment, standing still with the quality of stillness that people have when they're not gathering their thoughts, but letting a feeling find its own pace. She grew it for about 10 years, maybe 12. Then she stopped because nobody around here knew what to do with it, and she had 5 children to feed, and the practical math didn't work. She turned and looked at Rosalind directly. "I'm glad someone's growing it again." Rosalind looked out at the field. "Thank you," she said. It was all she said, simply and without elaboration, because it was the first unreservedly positive thing anyone outside her own household had said about the corn in 4 full growing seasons. It landed with a weight that surprised her. It sat in her chest for the rest of the evening like something warm. 2 weeks later, she was at the kitchen table working through the fall accounts when Darla came to the back door. "There's a truck at the end of the lane." She paused. "Out-of-state plates." Rosalind looked up. "Tennessee." "I didn't see. I just noticed it wasn't a local vehicle." She went to the window. In the fading September light at the far end of the farm lane, she could see a dark green truck sitting with its engine off, dust still drifting around the rear wheels. The kind of vehicle that had traveled a considerable distance and wasn't making any particular point about announcing itself. She watched it for a moment. "I'll go see what they want," she said. She walked down the lane with the smell of the corn drying in the fields on either side of her, a smell she had known her entire life, and registered so automatically that she rarely noticed it separately from everything else that composed the farm. Tonight she noticed it. The truck had Tennessee plates. The driver's door opened before she was halfway down the lane, and a man climbed out. He was tall and gray-haired, somewhere in his mid-60s, and he carried himself with the measured deliberateness of someone who had been in a vehicle for a very long time and was still calibrating the transition to standing on the ground. He looked around at the farm with the specific attention of a person who is seeing something they have been trying to locate. Then he looked at the field of corn, visible through the gate beside the lane. His entire expression changed. Not dramatically, not the theatrical change of a person performing surprise. A quieter shift, like something in his face settling into a position that had been waiting for it. He walked toward her and extended his hand. "My name's Dempsey Pruitt." She shook it. "Rosalind Wexler." He looked past her at the corn. "Is that your field?" "It is." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stalks moving slightly in the September air. Then he looked back at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "May I taste some?" The question stopped her. Not because it was strange exactly, but because in 4 years of trying to sell this corn to every buyer she could locate, not one person had asked that. Not the co-op, not the elevator, not the specialty grocers, not the restaurant chefs who talked about local and artisanal and heritage all the time, while asking the same questions as everyone else about volume and grading and delivery schedules and price per bushel. Nobody had asked whether they could taste it. She looked at him for a moment. That's an unusual first question. He smiled slightly. Is it? She went to the nearest row and pulled an ear and brought it back. He took it and peeled the husk back, slowly examining the kernels in the failing September light before he put it to his mouth. He took a bite. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she started to pay attention to it. He chewed slowly. His eyes went to a different distance, the focused internal distance of a person concentrating on a sensory experience they want to understand fully before saying anything about it. He looked at the ear, then at her, then at the ear again. Good Lord, he said quietly. She waited. Where did you get this variety? She told him. She told him about Virgil and the experimental plot and the 6 notebooks in the small folded seed packet in the white envelope and the sentence that had waited in a filing cabinet for 4 years before she planted it. She told him about the university thesis from the 1960s and about trying roadside stands and specialty grocers and restaurants and the co-op visit and what Orville Odom had said. Dempsey Pruitt listened the way a person listens when they need every word, with a stillness and concentration that was unlike the polite half-attention most people offered in conversations about corn. When she finished, he looked out at the field. I knew there had to be something like this, he said. I've been driving around looking for it for 14 months. Looking for what? He turned back to her. He seemed to be deciding how to simplify something. A flavor quality in corn that commercial breeding has bred out over the past 40 years because it didn't serve yield or uniformity. A specific way certain older varieties converted starches during kernel development that created a flavor architecture you simply cannot find in any modern hybrid. He paused. I've looked at a lot of varieties. None of them were this. She looked at him for a moment. You're a distiller. He nodded. Small batch bourbon and specialty whiskey. Pruitt, Tennessee spirits out of Franklin County. We've been trying to source the right base grain for a new whiskey expression for almost 2 years. He paused. 14 months of that has been driving. She took a moment with this. You drove all the way from Tennessee for corn. He looked back at the field. For this corn, he said. Yes. She walked him through the south slope field as the last light faded. He moved through the rows the way someone moves through something they want to understand in depth rather than simply observe. He pulled ears from different positions from the field's edges and center and end rows from plants that had developed differently from their neighbors, and he ate each one with the same focused attention he had given the first. He asked about the soil profile of the south slope and about rainfall distribution through the growing season and about how she managed soil moisture in late summer and about her timing for harvest. He asked how she selected the seeds she saved each year and whether she had noticed consistent differences between individual plants over multiple seasons, which was a question that told her something about what he actually understood. At one point, he stopped moving and simply stood in the middle of the field eating corn in the September darkness without saying anything. She and Darla stood at the field's edge watching him. Darla came close. Who is this person? I honestly don't know yet, Rosalind said, but I'm going to find out. They ate supper at the kitchen table later, the three of them. Dempsey ate with the specific hunger of someone who has been driving since before dawn and has forgotten to stop for food. He didn't talk much during the meal. After over coffee, he became more specific about what he was looking for and why. He explained the technical requirements for the grain he'd been searching for in terms Rosalind could follow an outline, if not in every detail. He talked about fermentation characteristics and the way flavor compounds developed in the distillation process and what distinguished corn that produced merely serviceable whiskey from corn that produced something a person would remember specifically and seek out again. He asked if he could see the notebooks. She got up from the table and went to the filing cabinet and came back with all 6 of them stacked in her arms. She set them on the table but kept one hand resting on top of the stack. She looked at Dempsey. These don't leave this house. He nodded. I wouldn't take them. She held her hand there for another moment. Then she stepped back and sat down. He opened the top notebook with the careful handling of someone who understood that old things were fragile in ways that weren't always visible. He read slowly, going back occasionally to reread, following the numbers and the observations, with a focus that gradually made the kitchen very quiet around him. The clock marked the time. Darla refilled the coffee cups without a word and sat back down and watched him with the expression of someone who is revising a previous assessment of a situation. 20 minutes went by. He looked up. He looked across the table at Rosalind with an expression that she recognized as the particular expression of someone who has confirmed something they suspected but wasn't certain of. He knew, he said. Your grandfather understood exactly what this was. He was documenting it correctly in the 1950s, probably the 1940s, without the scientific vocabulary for what he was observing, but with the right instincts about what mattered. He turned a page and pointed without touching the text. Look at what he's tracking here. He was waiting for the right person to find this. Rosalind looked at the notebooks on the table and thought about an August evening, a long time ago. In the taste of corn at the end of a row, in a sentence about flavor being harder to explain to a bank. I'll take samples and run a full laboratory analysis, Dempsey said. I want proper fermentation trials in my own facility. Give me 3 weeks. If the results are what I expect, I'd like to talk about a long-term contract. She looked at him. And if they're not, he smiled slightly. Then I'll have driven a very long way and will drive back and keep looking. He stood and pulled on his jacket. I don't think that's going to happen. She walked him out to the truck. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the south slope were very bright. He loaded the coolers he had brought with him, the coolers of a man who came prepared, and climbed into the cab and rolled down the window. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she repeated. She watched the tail lights move down the lane and turn onto the county road and become nothing. She stood in the yard in the cold and dark for a moment. Somewhere in the house she could hear Darla washing the coffee cups. She looked up at the stars and thought about her grandfather planting a row of corn on a south-facing slope and writing careful observations in a notebook and holding on to something for 40 years because he believed in it. Then she went inside. The 3 weeks Dempsey Pruitt had promised became 4, then 5. Then the middle of the 6th week arrived, and nobody from Tennessee had called, and nobody from Tennessee had written, and the dark green truck with Tennessee plates had not appeared again at the end of the farm lane. Rosalind checked her phone twice the first morning after the 3-week mark, then once the second morning, then stopped checking and told herself this was a reasonable thing to stop doing because laboratory analyses took time and small distillery operations ran on tight schedules, and there were 100 plausible reasons why a timeline extended beyond its original estimate. She told herself this in the composed and practical part of her mind that understood these things intellectually. The other part of her mind was doing its own arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not friendly. The loan review was scheduled for November 15th, 7 weeks away when Dempsey had left. Then 6, then 5. Each day, the silence from Tennessee acquired a slightly different texture, the way a sound you've been waiting to hear shifts in quality as the waiting extends. She worked through it the way she worked through most difficulties, which was to find enough physical work to occupy the body while the mind worked through the problem without being watched too closely. She repaired the equipment shed roof where 2 panels had lifted in an August windstorm and been improperly secured when she'd addressed them temporarily in September. She turned the cover crops under on the east fields before the hard frost came in. She serviced the tractor through the fall maintenance checklist and cataloged the winter supply inventory and completed the fence work on the north boundary that she'd been postponing since June when the summer workload had made it impractical. She worked steadily and slightly faster than the work required, which was the pace she used when she was managing something internal. Darla didn't mention the phone. She didn't ask whether Dempsey had called, and she didn't speculate about what the absence of a call might mean, and she refilled the coffee before it was empty and made sure dinner was ready at a reasonable hour. And none of this was discussed between them, but all of it was understood. It was a particular form of companionship that required no acknowledgement to function. She thought about Dempsey on the drives between the farm and town. The drives were short enough to be purposeless in any practical sense, but long enough for the mind to run without supervision. She thought about the way he had stood in the middle of the south slope field in the early dark eating corn, the way he had handled Virgil's notebooks with the careful deference of someone who understood the difference between useful old things and merely old things. She thought about his question concerning which individual plants had shown consistent differences over multiple seasons, a question that required genuine knowledge to formulate. A man who didn't know what he was looking for didn't ask that question. A man running down a possibility asked that question and asked it with that particular precision, and then went back to Tennessee to do the work the question was preparing for. She had been carrying what he said, looking at the notebooks for 3 weeks without intending to. He was waiting for the right person to find this. She had not told Darla she was carrying it. She could not entirely explain to herself or anyone else why a stranger's reading of 6 old notebooks had the quality it had, except that nobody else had ever read them the same way, with that particular quality of recognition, the way you look at something and know it immediately as a thing you have been looking for. You could not fake that look. She had seen it on his face and she believed it was real, and believing it was real was making the silence from Tennessee harder than she wanted it to be. In the 4th week, Prescott Aldrich called. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of flat, gray October afternoon that was neither threatening nor pleasant, just the background weather of waiting. She was in the equipment shed checking the hydraulic lines on the tractor when her phone rang. His voice had the particular tone of a man who has decided that advance notice constitutes consideration, that giving someone time to prepare for a difficult thing is nearly the same as making the difficult thing easier. "Rosalind," he said, "I wanted to check in before the November review. I know we've talked about the situation, and I want to make sure neither of us has any surprises." She stood very still beside the tractor. "I appreciate the call, Prescott. I've been reviewing the South acreage income for the past 3 seasons," he said. "The specialty corn isn't showing substantially different returns than last year. Without a significant change in that picture, I'm going to have a hard time arguing for a renewal on current terms to the board." He paused. "I want you to have time to think about your options before we sit down." "I understand. Are there developments I'm not aware of? Anything that might change the financial picture between now and the 15th?" She looked at the hydraulic line in her hand. She thought about a man standing in the middle of her cornfield in September, eating ears, without saying anything. She thought about a truck with Tennessee plates that had not come back. She said nothing confirmed. A careful pause from his end. "All right, I'll see you on the 15th. She set the phone down on the workbench. The equipment shed smelled of oil and dust and cold concrete, familiar smells, the smells of a working farm in autumn, and she stood there a moment letting them settle around her because they were specifics and real and required nothing of her. Then she went back to checking the hydraulic line because there was still work to do, and standing still had never changed anything she was aware of. Nothing confirmed. The phrase had come to her naturally, and she had spoken it without planning it, and she recognized, standing in the shed afterward, that it was precisely accurate and also precisely inadequate to describe where she was. She had the notebooks. She had 4 years of cultivation. She had samples sitting in a laboratory in Tennessee, presumably in the possession of a man who had said 3 weeks. What she did not have was anything that would mean anything to Prescott Aldrich, who moved through the world by way of confirmed figures and documented commitments. He was not unreasonable. He was not unkind. He was a man whose job was to evaluate risk according to the tools available to him, and none of the tools available to a community bank loan officer in Callaway County, Missouri had a category for 6 notebooks and 40 years of flavor documentation, and a distiller who drove overnight to stand in a field in the dark. She thought about calling Dempsey. She turned this over several times across the next 2 days, setting it down each time for reasons she could not entirely articulate. She did not call him. She could not decide whether this was patience or pride, and she found she could not fully tell the difference between those two things from the inside. The 5th week brought Eldon Mabry. She was replacing a rotted post on the north fence line, a physical job that she liked for its simplicity and its specific demands on the body. When she heard his truck slow on the county road and stop, she kept working. Footsteps across the gravel shoulder, and then he was on the other side of the fence with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket, watching her drive the post. "Rosalind, Eldon." A pause, the wind moving through the dry grass at the fence base. He waited until she pulled the driver back up. "How's the fall looking?" She drove the post again. "Fine." He was quiet. She kept working. After a moment, "That whiskey fellow, did he call?" She looked up briefly. "Not yet." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who has received confirmation of what he expected, the specific satisfaction of a pessimistic prediction proving accurate. He didn't say anything more. He just stood there for a moment longer with the wind working around him, and then he walked back to his truck, and she heard the door and the engine, and then nothing. She drove the post 3 more times with slightly more force than the work required. She and Eldon had known each other across the full length of their farming lives, which in Callaway County meant across most of what either of them could clearly remember. He was a practical man, careful with money, and careful with conclusions, and these were qualities she respected and had at times relied on when she needed an honest assessment of something rather than a kind one. But there was a particular type of certainty that practical men sometimes carried that had nothing to do with evidence, the kind of certainty that was actually a habit of mind rather than a conclusion reached through any visible process of reasoning. Eldon had that quality in full measure. She had known on the February morning when she had stood at the seed display looking at the old Ozark catalog exactly what Eldon would say before he said it. She had known what the co-op would say and what the general weight of county opinion would be because she had grown up inside all of these people's ways of thinking, which were not stupid, but which moved in the particular direction their experience pointed and stopped at the edges of it. They were right about most things. They were reliably wrong about the specific category of thing that Virgil's notebooks described things that were genuinely good, but hadn't yet found the market that understood what good meant in their specific register. The county had spent 30 years not understanding what Virgil had. It would not have surprised him. He had kept his experimental plot behind the barn, away from the road, documented in private, shared only with a 14-year-old girl who was the only family member who asked questions he found worth answering. She finished the fence post and moved to the next one and worked through the morning without stopping. The evenings in the 5th week had a particular quality to them. She sat at the kitchen table after dinner and did the accounts or read or did nothing in particular, while Darla watched the television in the next room, and in the back of her mind she ran through the scenario she had been avoiding looking at directly. If Dempsey Pruitt did not call, if the bank did not renew on current terms, if she needed to refinance at a rate that would change the operation's financial structure substantially, if she converted the South Slope back to commercial corn. The numbers worked under that scenario, barely and in ways she found deeply unpleasant to think about, but they worked. She could sell the specialty seed stock and plant the South Slope with a standard commercial hybrid and reduce the farm to the kind of operation that Prescott Aldrich's board found reassuring. She would lose what Virgil had been working toward. She would lose what she had been working toward for 4 years. She would not lose the farm. She sat with that calculation for several evenings without making any decision, because there was no decision to make yet. The decision point was November 15th, and between now and November 15th, there was only the waiting. But the calculation had become visible in a way it had not been before Prescott's call, and she found she could not quite stop looking at it once she had looked at it directly. It was like a loose board in a floor. You could go days without thinking about it, and then your foot found it once, and after that you thought about it every time you crossed that part of the room. One evening she walked to the edge of the South Slope field and stood there in the dark. The stalks were cut. The earth was resting under the October cold, dark and still, and giving away nothing. She stood at the field's edge and looked across it and thought about Virgil bringing her through his experimental plot on an August evening and holding out an ear of corn to her in the late summer light. She had not understood then why he moved through those rows with the quality of attention he gave them. She had eaten the corn because he offered it, and because it was good, and because she was 14, and 14-year-olds ate corn without philosophizing about why it mattered that it tasted the way it did. She understood it now, precisely, which is the way understanding usually arrives. You spend years accumulating the experience required to understand the thing someone showed you a long time ago. And then one day the experience is sufficient and the understanding is sudden, and you cannot explain why it waited so long to arrive. She went back inside. She did not convert the South Slope in her mind that night, or any night after. But she held the possibility carefully, the way you carry something fragile through a room, with obstacles, knowing exactly where it is and exactly what it would cost to put it down. In the 6th week, Letha Crane arrived. Letha was 34 and had covered the agricultural beat at the Callaway County Gazette for 6 years. She was a native of the county, which gave her a working knowledge of how farming operated in that part of Missouri without giving her any particular emotional investment in defending it. She drove a small car that was slightly too new for the county roads and always had her camera with her, which was a habit rather than a statement. She pulled into the farm lane on a Thursday morning without calling ahead, which was also a habit, and knocked on the kitchen door with the directness of someone who had learned that announcing your intentions clearly saved time for everyone. Rosalind recognized her immediately. She had been at the co-op on the day Orville Odom had made his assessment of the corn. She had stood near the door with her camera and notebook and had not written anything down or said anything. But she had watched the whole thing with the particular attention of a journalist who has identified a story that isn't ready to be a story yet and is willing to wait. "I'd like to write a piece about you," Letha said when Rosalind opened the door. "About what?" "About what you're doing with the South Field. The heritage corn." She said it simply and directly, which Rosalind appreciated even when she didn't welcome the request. Rosalind leaned against the doorframe. She thought about how to say what she wanted to say. "That's not the story I want told right now," she said finally. Letha waited with this patience of someone who understands that first refusals are positions rather than conclusions. "What story do you want told?" Rosalind looked out past her at the south slope, the field empty now of corn, just cut stalks and turned earth. She thought about Dempsey Pruitt, standing in the field in the dark eating corn, with his eyes closed, the concentrated attention of a man working through something important. She thought about the notebooks on the shelf and the envelope in the filing cabinet drawer. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "When I do, I'll find you." Letha held her gaze for a moment, evaluating whether this was a real answer or a polite dismissal. She appeared to decide it was real. She took a card from her jacket pocket and gave it to Rosalind, and she walked back to her car and drove away without pressing further. Rosalind went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a while. She thought about what story she wanted told because Letha's question had been genuine and deserved a genuine answer, even if the answer was only going to arrive after the fact. The story she did not want told was the version centered on being proved right, on the vindication of a person who had persisted against community opinion and been rewarded for persistence. That version was accurate in its outline and entirely inadequate in its specifics. The thing that had happened over 4 years was not primarily about being right. It was about maintaining fidelity to something a dead man had spent his life documenting, something that was real, whether or not anyone around her could recognize it as real, something that existed independent of whether the county co-op laughed, or a banker reviewed her figures, or a distiller from Tennessee ever answered his phone. The corn was what the corn was. That had been true before any of this and would have been true if none of it had happened. She did not feel vindicated. She felt, when she let herself feel anything about it at all, a kind of continuation rather than a conclusion. That evening, she went to the equipment shed alone after dinner. The fluorescent tube buzzed the way it always buzzed, the persistent low hum that she had stopped hearing unless she specifically listened for it. She opened the filing cabinet drawer and took out the envelope and sat on the overturned crate and held it, not opening it, just holding it, the way she did a few times a year when she needed to think and needed something tangible to think next to. She heard steps on the gravel outside. Arvilla Tull appeared in the doorway, bundled in her winter coat, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Her evening walks took her along the fence line between the two properties before she cut back to her own house, a route she had kept for as long as Rosalind could remember. She looked at Rosalind sitting on the crate. "What are you doing out here?" Rosalind looked up, thinking. Arvilla came inside and sat on the hay bale across from her, settling in the way of someone who has decided to stay for a while. The fluorescent tube buzzed between them. The cold was serious now, the kind that settled into unheated spaces and held there. "Virgil used to do exactly this," Arvilla said. "Sit out here in the shed in the cold when he had something he was working through." She paused. "I could see the light from my kitchen window when Gerald and I were first married and Virgil was still farming full-time. I used to think it was just something farmers did. Sitting with their problems in the cold. Like the cold helped." Rosalind looked down at the envelope. "He did it a lot," Arvilla considered. "More toward the later years." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother grew that same corn variety," she said, "on her place south of the county line. She never knew its name and didn't know anyone else grew it, thought it was just a peculiar variety that had come through her family somehow. She kept it because it tasted like something. That was all the reason she needed. When she died, there wasn't anyone left to keep it, and it was gone inside of 2 seasons. Rosalind looked up slowly. "I recognized it the second I saw your ear shape that first year," Arvilla said. came over the fence line and walked to the edge of the south slope and knew it immediately. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. What do you tell someone who spent years growing the same thing your mother couldn't sell either? Rosalind turned the envelope in her hands. You could have told me. Arvilla met her eyes steadily. I know, she was quiet. I think I was afraid of making it heavier. You were already carrying enough of it. The cold settled between them. The fluorescent tube made it sound. He believed in that corn more than he ever let on to most people, Arvilla said finally. Virgil, I mean. He talked about it once to Gerald years before he died, and Gerald told me afterward. He said Virgil believed there was a market for it somewhere that farming people hadn't thought to look yet. He just didn't know where, and he didn't know if he'd live long enough to find it. Rosalind turned the envelope in her hands. He was right about there being a market. I think he was right. I just don't know if the person who was supposed to show me where it is has actually found me, or if I got my hopes up about a stranger who drove past and then drove back home. Arvilla looked at her without any particular change in expression. You didn't imagine him. You never met him. No. But you're sitting in a cold shed holding an envelope at 8 in the evening instead of being in a warm house. And people only do that when something real is keeping them. The cold settled. The fluorescent tube made its sound. Go inside, Arvilla said. The cold doesn't actually help. Rosalind put the envelope back in the jacket pocket where she'd carried it outside and stood. She walked back to the house and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the notebooks on the shelf where she'd been keeping them within reach and waited for something she couldn't name. The next morning, she went out to check the equipment at first light, which was her habit. The sky was gray-white and the frost had settled on every north-facing surface, and the air had the sharp, clean quality of cold that had arrived and intended to stay. She came around the corner of the equipment shed. Dempsey Pruitt's green truck was parked at the end of the lane. He was standing beside it with a thick folder under his arm. The frost lay on the truck's roof and hood and the windshield, which meant he had been there since before the sun came up or had driven through most of the night. He was looking at the south slope field in the early morning light, and he was not smiling. In September, his face had been open in the way of someone who had found something they had been looking for and couldn't quite conceal how much it mattered. This face was closed. Not troubled exactly, but contained in a way that told her nothing certain about what the folder under his arm contained. He saw her and turned. She walked toward him without hurrying. She got within 10 feet of him and looked at his face and prepared herself as calmly as she could manage for the version of this moment that ended with her converting the south slope to commercial corn in the spring. She held the possibility steadily, the way you hold something you have been carrying long enough that you are no longer afraid of it. She was ready. She would be all right either way, and she knew this, and the knowing of it steadied her. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, full and sudden, the laugh of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and can finally set it down. He laughed for several seconds and then set the folder on the hood of the truck and spread it open against the frost, smoothing the pages flat with both hands. Rosalind, he said, do you have any idea what you've grown here? She looked at the document spread across the hood. Corn, she said. He shook his head. No, he pointed at one report and then another, and then a third pages of laboratory analysis and fermentation data and production notes. He looked up at her. This corn makes the finest whiskey I have ever distilled in 31 years. She was very still. He reached into the folder and pulled out a document separate from the rest and laid it flat in front of her. A contract. She looked at the numbers in the relevant column and read them once and stopped and read them again carefully to make sure she was reading them correctly. She looked up at him. 7 times market price. He nodded. For all of it. Everything I produce. Yes. He was watching her face. She read the numbers again. The morning was cold and very quiet. A crow somewhere in the tree line to the north was making noise. The frost was releasing from the south-facing surfaces, now as the light strengthened. 7 times. She thought about Prescott Aldrich's office and the November 15th date in the calendar, and the feed-grade conversation in the co-op, and the 5 weeks in 6 weeks of waiting in the cold. She put all of it on one side of a scale, and the document on the hood of the truck on the other side. There was no comparison. Why did you drive here? She said. You could have mailed this or sent it another way. He looked at her steadily. Because I wanted to see the face of the person I'll be doing business with for the next 10 years. He paused. And because the man who kept those notebooks deserved to have this news delivered to his farm in person. She stood very still in the cold for another moment. Then she picked up the contract. She took the folder too because the laboratory reports belonged on that farm as much as the notebooks did. She walked with him back to the kitchen, and Darla was at the stove and turned when they came in and saw Dempsey and looked at Rosalind's face. She had a particular gift for reading Rosalind's face, which she had developed over a lifetime of careful attention and which Rosalind had never once tried to disguise. Darla said nothing. She put 3 cups on the table and poured. Dempsey spread the reports across the table the way he had spread them across the hood of the truck. Methodically, the reports of a man who understood that documentation was the only thing that made an argument permanent. He walked through them in sequence. The fermentation trials first, which he described in the language of his trade, the specific vocabulary of a man who had spent 31 years turning grain into something people remembered. Then the comparative analysis, which placed the corn from the South Slope field against other base grains from distilleries across Tennessee, Kentucky, and the upper Midwest. Then the sensory evaluation, which used the formal language of professional tasting, but which Dempsey summarized in a single sentence: "There is nothing like it." Darla listened with both hands around her coffee cup. When Dempsey finished walking through the reports, she looked at the contract on the table without picking it up, just reading the number from where she sat. She looked up at him. "You drove all night for this." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." Darla looked at Rosalind. Then she picked up her coffee and leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a small, contained expression that Rosalind had seen exactly twice before in their shared life, both times in circumstances that had required years of patience to arrive at. Rosalind signed the contract at the kitchen table in the morning light, with the laboratory reports spread around her and her coffee going cold at her elbow. The pen made a small, specific sound against the paper. Outside, the October morning continued its business without reference to anything happening inside the house. Frost pulling back from the south-facing surfaces as the sun came up, a pair of crows crossing the field above the cut stalks, the distant sound of a neighbor's equipment starting up somewhere past the county road. Nothing in the physical world was different from what it had been 20 minutes ago. Everything in the practical world had changed entirely. Dempsey left after noon. She walked him out to the truck, and they stood for a moment in the thin October sunlight. He would arrange transport for the first shipment before the end of the month. He wanted to move quickly, he said, not because haste was necessary, but because he had been waiting a long time for this grain. And now that he had found it, he didn't see any reason to let it sit idle. She understood that she told him. He climbed into the cab and rolled down the window. He looked at the South Slope field one more time from the window. Then he looked at her. "Your grandfather was a careful man," he said. "Everything in those notebooks is the work of someone who understood that careful observation is the only thing that survives long enough to matter." She looked at the field. She said. Dempsey nodded. He put the truck in reverse and backed down the lane. She watched the truck until it was past the county road and gone the same way she had watched it in September, when it had left with the coolers of samples. But this time there was nothing to wait for. The waiting was finished. What was left was the work. She went back inside. Darla was still at the table. "What do you want to do first?" Darla said. Rosalind picked up the contract and looked at it. "I need to make a call," she said. The quiet of the week that Eldon's truck had stopped and then driven away was different from the quiet of the weeks before it. The difference was not in the absence of sound, but in the quality of what Rosalind was alone with now that the expectation had been spoken. Nothing confirmed she had told Prescott. Not yet she had told Eldon. These were honest sentences that contained everything she knew and told nothing about how the not knowing sat in the body, which was a place language was not very good at getting to. She thought that week about what patience actually cost. She had thought of it as a method, as a form of discipline, as the way certain things were done because they could not be done faster. But the 5th week of silence from Tennessee taught her something different. Patience was not passive. It was a continuous, active effort to remain in a position of uncertainty without being taken over by it. And the effort was real, and the con was real. She was spending something every day of the waiting. She had enough to spend, but she was spending it. Darla found her at the kitchen table late one evening with the accounts finished and nothing in front of her but an empty notepad and a pen she wasn't using. Darla stood in the doorway in her robe with a glass of water, the patient posture of someone who has been watching a situation and deciding for some time whether to say anything. "You know it might not work out," Darla said, not as a criticism, as a fact. Rosalind looked at the empty notepad. "I know. And you're okay with that. Rosalind was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to say something that was true rather than just reassuring. I've been okay with it before, she said. If it doesn't work out, I'll be okay with it again. Darla held her gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her room. She did not say anything else, which was the right call. Rosalind sat with the notepad for another few minutes and then went to bed. She slept soundly, which kept surprising her. She had expected the waiting to cost her sleep the way it cost other things. But her sleep was undisturbed, which she took as evidence that whatever she had spent on patience during the day was fully spent by the time night came, leaving nothing to process further. The night before Dempsey's truck appeared, she had a dream she rarely had. It was not a dramatic dream, not the kind that announced itself as significant. She was in the experimental plot on the South Slope, but it was an evening from her childhood, late summer, the particular soft light of an August evening in Missouri that she could identify precisely even in sleep. Virgil was there, but he wasn't doing anything. He was just standing at the edge of the first row, looking out across the plot, the way you look at something you have tended carefully for a long time and are satisfied with. He wasn't saying anything. He didn't need to. She woke before dawn, which was her habit in any season. She dressed and went outside. The frost covered every north-facing surface, and the green truck was at the end of the lane, and Dempsey was already standing beside it with the folder looking at the South Slope field. She had signed the contract before the morning was an hour old. She drove to First Callaway Bank at 9 o'clock when the lobby had just opened, and the early business was the sort of routine transaction that required nothing from Prescott Aldrich personally. His door was open. He looked up when she knocked on the frame and gestured to the chair across from his desk with the measured courtesy of a man who is prepared for what he believes is a difficult conversation and has arranged himself to conduct it professionally. She sat down. She placed the contract on the desk and slid it across to him. He picked it up. He read the first page with a neutral expression. He read it again. He turned to the second page. The office was quiet enough that she could hear the clock on the wall and faintly the sound of a teller's drawer opening at the front of the building. He read the third page and set the contract down and looked at her. He didn't say anything immediately. "This is executed," he said finally. "Yes. Pruitt, Tennessee Spirits." "Yes." He looked at the contract again, at the price per bushel, at the volume commitments, at the term of 10 years. He set it down a second time and looked at her with the expression of a careful man who has encountered something he miscalculated, which was rare enough for him that his face wasn't entirely sure where to put it. "This is current. This is real. I can wait here while you call them if you want to confirm," she said. "I have the time." He looked up at her. "That won't be necessary." "Good." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'll be able to pay the full balance of the mortgage note before December 15th. Principal plus interest in full." Prescott Aldrich was quiet. "I wanted you to know before the scheduled review," she said, "so you could adjust your planning accordingly." He nodded once. His face had found the expression it was looking for, the careful, professional courtesy that served him in all circumstances, including the ones he hadn't anticipated. She stood. She picked up the contract from his desk. At the door, she stopped and turned back because there was something she had decided to say on the drive over, and she wanted to say it clearly without heat, which was the only register in which it was worth saying. "I'll be keeping my accounts at this bank," she said. "I want you to know that's a choice, not a situation." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded again. She walked through the lobby and out into the October morning. She sat in her truck for a minute with the engine off. She was not feeling triumphant. Triumph was the wrong word, and she had known it would be the wrong word before she walked in. What she was feeling was something more like the lifting of a sustained low-grade pressure, the way you realize a sound you've been hearing continuously for a long time has finally stopped, which you only notice because of the silence it leaves behind. The absence of something and not triumph. It is just the absence of a thing that was there for a long time and is not there anymore. She drove back to the farm. The first shipment left 3 weeks later. Dempsey had arranged the transport through a company he used regularly for large volume contracts. 3 specialized grain trailers came down from the north on a Tuesday morning, backed into the farm lane, one at a time, and loaded out with an efficiency that made the whole operation look routine, which Rosalind observed with a quiet satisfaction because she had never felt the operation was anything other than routine in its fundamentals, and it was useful to see it treated that way by people who had seen enough of these operations to know the difference. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched the last trailer pull out. Darla came to stand beside her. "That's it," Darla said. "That's the first one," Rosalind said. The trailers turned onto the county road heading north. They passed through town on their way to the highway. They passed Orville Odom's co-op, whose front windows faced the road. The lettering on the side of the transport company's trucks was not especially large, but at that distance, it was legible to anyone who happened to be looking. Pruitt Tennessee Spirits, contract carrier. Orville Odom was at the window because a customer who had come in for supplies had pointed out the trucks going by. He watched all three trailers pass without comment. Eldon Mabry was in the co-op picking up a fall supply order, and he came to the window too. He watched the third trailer until it was past the curve and gone. Neither man said anything for a moment. "Who's buying her corn?" the customer said. Orville read the lettering on the trailers from memory. Pruitt Tennessee Spirits. A different customer who happened to know the name said, "That's a real operation. High-end small batch. Nationally distributed in specialty markets." The room was quiet for a moment, in the specific way rooms go quiet when they are absorbing a piece of information that requires adjusting several things at once. There is a sound to that kind of quiet, a particular quality of collective recalibration that is different from the ordinary quiet of a room at rest. Orville went back to the counter and finished what he was doing. He was efficient and quiet for the rest of that morning. At noon, he ate his lunch in the back office with the door closed, which was not his usual habit. Letha Crane had been driving on the county road and saw the trailers from her car. She pulled over and watched them go by and wrote down the transport company name in her notebook. Then she called her editor at the Callaway County Gazette from her car and said she had a story. Then she called Pruitt Tennessee Spirits. The communications office confirmed the contract, confirmed the product line, mentioned, because Letha had structured her questions carefully, that the corn from Wexler Farm in Callaway County, Missouri, was the primary base grain for a new whiskey expression Pruitt intended to release the following spring, and that the expression had already begun generating interest among specialty spirits retailers who followed the company's output closely. Letha called Rosalind. "I have information," she said. Rosalind had expected this call sooner or later. "What kind?" "The kind that gets published whether or not you talk to me." She said it simply as a fact rather than a pressure. "I'd rather you have the chance to be part of the story." "What story are you telling?" A pause while Letha organized what she actually wanted to say. "The one where the woman who grew the corn nobody wanted was right all along. That's the story." Rosalind stood at the kitchen window looking out at the south slope field. The stalks were brown and cut, and the earth was visible beneath them, dark and resting. In the spring, she would plant again. More acreage this time. The contract's volume requirements meant expanding to the upper north slope as well, which she had been working through in her planning notebooks. "All right," she said. "Come out tomorrow morning." Letha came the next morning, and they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Darla brought coffee and stayed filling in details when Rosalind was brief. Rosalind showed Letha the notebooks, not to photograph, but to understand. She showed her the envelope and the seed packet and the piece of paper on which Virgil had written his instruction. Letha read it and was quiet for a moment. "Can I write that down?" "Yes," Letha wrote. She wrote with the deliberate hand of someone who understands that some things need to be exact and some things need to be fast, and this was a thing that needed to be exact. She looked up from her notebook. "How old were you when he showed you the seed?" 14. "And you kept it for how long before you planted?" 12 years. Letha looked at her notepad. 12 years. Rosalind looked at the notebook stacked between them on the table. "He kept it for 40, she said. Letha was quiet for a moment. She wrote something else. Then she set down her pen and looked at Rosalind directly in a way that was not a journalist looking at a subject, but a person looking at another person who has done something that deserved more than a column in a county paper. "I'm going to write this correctly," she said. "I want you to know that." Rosalind believed her. The article ran in the Callaway County Gazette that Friday. The headline was, "The Corn Nobody Wanted." The subhead explained the partnership with Pruitt Tennessee Spirits. Letha had written it with the specificity of someone who understood agriculture and the care of someone who understood the human story at the center of it. She had quoted accurately. She had noted without particular editorializing that the county co-op had evaluated the corn and found it unsuitable for commodity markets, and that a distillery in Tennessee had found it to be the finest base grain they had ever used. The juxtaposition was enough. Letha had not needed to point at it. The Kansas City Star ran a condensed version 3 days later. A regional agricultural trade publication ran a longer feature the following week oriented toward the specialty crops angle, which traced the history of heritage grain preservation and the specific economics of craft spirits supply chains. A podcast focused on the American craft spirits industry dedicated 30 minutes to the story the week after that, and its audience was exactly the kind of people who cared specifically about where base grain originated and who had been waiting for that story to exist. The phone calls began the Wednesday after the Star piece ran. Not all of them were buyers, though some were. A professor from the University of Missouri's Agricultural Extension Program called and asked whether she would discuss the variety's characteristics for a research project on heritage grain systems in the Ozark region. An organization called the Heartland Seed Conservancy called and asked whether she would work with them to formally document and preserve the variety's genetic material in the National Heritage Grain Registry. A distillery in Kentucky called, one in Oregon called, a food journalist from Chicago called, and asked about visiting the following spring when the planting was underway. She handled each conversation carefully and made no commitments beyond the existing contract, but she wrote everything down in a new notebook she had bought specifically for this purpose. The notebook was the same brand and size as Virgil's notebooks. She had not planned this. She had reached for a notebook in the back of the equipment shed supply cabinet, and it was what was there, the same blue cover and lined pages that she had grown up watching him fill with his deliberate, unhurried hand. She noticed this only after she had written 3 entries in it. She stood at the equipment shed cabinet for a moment looking at what she had chosen without choosing and did not say anything about it to anyone. On the afternoon that Kentucky Distillery called, she walked across the frost-hardened field between the Wexler farm and Arvilla Tull's property carrying one of the 3 sample bottles Dempsey had sent her when the first batch was distilled. She knocked on the back door. Arvilla opened it and looked at the bottle. "Come in." They sat at Arvilla's kitchen table. The kitchen was small and crowded with the evidence of a long life kept rather than edited photographs, and small ceramic pieces and paperback novels stacked by the window, and a coffee tin full of pencils, and a clay pot holding wooden spoons, and the kind of collected things that accumulate over decades in a room where a person spends real time. It was the kitchen of someone who had decided that what had meaning was worth keeping, and what merely looked tidy was not a priority. Rosalind had eaten at that table as a girl and as a young woman, and had always felt in it the particular comfort of a room that had been fully inhabited. Arvilla held the bottle up and turned it toward the light from the window. The label said Pruitt, Tennessee Spirits. Below the main text in smaller print, it said Small Batch Reserve, Callaway County Heritage Corn, Single Origin. She was quiet for a while looking at the label. "My mother would not have believed this," she said. Rosalind looked at her. "I thought about her when I saw the label." Arvilla set the bottle down carefully on the table between them. She was quiet again, the particular quality of quiet that belongs to someone letting something find its own pace inside them. "You know what she would have said," Arvilla said. "Number." She would have said she was glad someone finally knew what she was growing. She paused. She never said it out loud to anyone. But I could tell it bothered her all her life. She had something that was genuinely good, and nobody around her could see what it was or why it mattered. Rosalind looked at the bottle on the table. "There's a lot of that," she said. "Having something worth keeping and no one around you seeing it." Arvilla looked at her. "Is that what it was like for you?" Rosalind thought about the co-op and what Orville Odom had said, and the casual laughter of a room full of people who were not being deliberately unkind, but who were simply certain. She thought about the evenings in the equipment shed holding an envelope. She thought about Eldon Mabry at the north fence line with his hands in his pockets, waiting for her to confirm what he expected. For a while, she said, she looked down at the table. She was not someone who cried easily. She had not cried at any point in the 4 years of the Corn Project, despite having had ample occasion to, and she had not cried when Dempsey had laughed and spread the laboratory reports on the hood of his truck, and she had not cried signing the contract. Something about Arvilla's kitchen and the bottle with the label and the description of Arvilla's mother, having something good that nobody around her could see, got into a place below the practical surface of things. It was brief and quiet. She pressed the back of her hand to her eyes and it passed. Arvilla sat across from her without moving or saying anything, which was exactly right. She did not offer a tissue or reach across the table or say anything consoling. She sat and waited and understood that some things pass faster when they are not commented upon. After a moment, Rosalind straightened and picked up the bottle and poured 2 small glasses. "Thank you," Arvilla said, "for bringing it." "Thank you," Rosalind said, "for sitting in the cold shed with me." They touched glasses and drank. The whiskey was warm and complicated in the specific way of something that had come from a long distance to arrive at its final form and carried the evidence of that distance in every swallow. Arvilla held the glass for a moment after she drank and looked at it. "My mother would have recognized it," she said quietly. "Even without the label, she would have known immediately what it came from." Rosalind believed this without question. Dempsey came through Callaway County the following Thursday. He had a morning meeting with Rosalind to go over volume projections for the next season's contract, after which he was driving back to Tennessee. On his way through town, he stopped at the co-op. Eldon Mabry was there picking up supplies and saw what happened. He described it to Rosalind 2 days later when he came by the farm standing at the fence line of the south slope with his hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when he was working through something. Dempsey came in without announcement. He bought a cup of coffee at the refreshment table. He stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the room the way a man looks at a room he is going to say something in and wants to have looked at properly before he says it. Then he turned to Orville Odom, who was working through invoice sheets at the main desk. "You're the one who evaluated the corn from Wexler Farm." Orville looked up slowly. His expression was of a man who has been carrying something he expected would arrive eventually. "I am." Dempsey took a moment before speaking, which was unusual for a man who generally went directly to what he meant. "I came in personally to thank you," he said. Nobody in the room said anything. The particular quality of that silence was the silence of people who have been given a sentence they cannot categorize immediately and are waiting for the next one to tell them how to hold it. "You evaluated it correctly," Dempsey said. "By every standard, your market runs on that corn doesn't qualify." He drank some coffee and set the cup down. "My market runs on different standards. If your evaluation had gone another way, I wouldn't have had access to it." Orville looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment." Dempsey picked up his coffee. "It's an observation," he said. He looked at the room in the way of someone who wants the room to understand something before he leaves. Then he walked out. Eldon sat in the co-op parking lot in his truck for a while after that before he drove home. "He seemed angry at first," Eldon told her. "Then I realized he wasn't. He meant exactly what he said." "He did," Rosalind said. Eldon was quiet, looking out at the south slope from where he was standing at the farm lane fence, his hands in his pockets. The earth had been turned for spring preparation and was dark and resting. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "When did you know?" he said, finally. "When did you know it was going to come out right?" She thought about this honestly rather than giving him the reassuring version. "I didn't know," she said. "I went through a period where I was fairly certain it wasn't going to." He turned to look at her. "You're serious?" "Yes," she paused. "I sat in the equipment shed one evening holding that envelope and working through whether I needed to pull up the whole field and go back to commercial corn and pay off the bank and let the whole thing go. The numbers worked if I did that." He didn't say anything. "The reason I didn't," she said, "was not because I was certain it would work out." She looked at the field. "It was because I didn't have anything solid telling me it wouldn't. And I had 40 years of Virgil's documentation telling me the thing I was working with was real. So I held on to that." Eldon looked back at the dark earth of the south slope. A cold wind came through the tree line and moved across the turned ground. "I laughed at this," he said. "For years, every time it came up." "Yes, I laughed at you specifically." "Yes." He shook his head. The particular headshake of a man confronting something about himself he would rather not confront but finds he cannot not look at. "What bothers me isn't that I was wrong," he said finally. "I've been wrong before. What bothers me is that I was so sure, I was absolutely certain you were making a mistake, and I said so, and I kept saying so, and I was entirely, completely wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "Eldon," she said, "you weren't laughing at the corn. You were laughing at something you didn't have a category for yet. That's what people do." He looked at her. "That sounds like you're letting me off." "I'm not." She turned to face him. "I'm just telling you what actually happened. You were operating with the categories you had, which were the same categories everyone else in that county was operating with. The corn didn't fit any of them, so you responded the way people respond to things that don't fit their categories." He was quiet. The wind moved through the fence line brush between them and the field. "He did understand it, though, your grandfather." She thought about Virgil standing in his experimental plot on an August evening with a 14-year-old girl at his side, holding out an ear of corn with the patient certainty of someone who knows they are right and has decided to wait. I think he understood that it was real, she said, and I think he understood that real things find their moment. He just didn't know when the moment would come or who it would arrive with. Tennessee plates, Eldon said quietly. More or less, she said. He was quiet again. A long pause with the wind in the tree line and the turned earth lying still in the afternoon light. Then he said, I would have liked to have met him. She looked at him slightly surprised by the simple sincerity of it. He would have liked talking to you, she said. He liked farmers who thought seriously about things, even when they arrived at the wrong conclusion. He just would have asked you harder questions than you were comfortable with. Eldon laughed once, a small sound, the laugh of someone who has been accurately described. That sounds exactly right. The wind moved across the prepared earth of the south slope. The late afternoon light came in at an angle that turned the turned soil almost golden, the same direction it had come from on the September evening when Dempsey Pruitt had first walked slowly through the field, tasting ears in the fading light. A different season. The same field. The same light doing the same thing to it that light had been doing to it for decades. That spring, Rosalind planted 22 acres. The south slope and the upper portion of the north slope almost exactly double the original acreage. She brought in 2 part-time workers for the season because the variety's requirements didn't compress well, and she refused to compromise on anything that would affect the grain's characteristics. She supervised every stage of the growing herself. The part-time workers understood quickly that they were working for someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why, and they adjusted accordingly. The season was good, not exceptional, not without its difficulties in July, when the rainfall ran short and required careful management, but good in the way of something that had been properly planned and consistently executed. Darla took over the administrative operation, the contracts and schedules and communications with Tennessee and with the various researchers and journalists and organizations that had accumulated around the story. She did this with a thorough competence that made Rosalind realize how much unnecessary management she had been carrying alone in the years before the administrative weight of a solo operation that could have been shared long since if the right structure had been in place. The University of Missouri researcher came in June. His name was Dr. Ashford Remley, a plant scientist in his 40s, who was slightly uncomfortable on working farms, but rigorous and respectful in everything he did. He wore clothing that was wrong for field work, but tried hard not to impede anyone. He spent 2 days walking the south slope and the north slope extension with Rosalind, asking careful questions and writing down her answers in a notebook with a professional speed. He was the kind of scientist who listened to farmers rather than instructing them, which Rosalind recognized as unusual and appreciated without commenting on it. On his second afternoon, he sat with the notebooks for 4 hours at the kitchen table. He read them the way Dempsey had read them, carefully, going back to reread passages, making notes on his own pad, occasionally pausing to look at nothing in particular while he thought through what he had just read. Rosalind brought him coffee twice and did not interrupt. Darla, passing through to refill the water pitcher, glanced at his face and gave Rosalind a small look that communicated another one. He looked up eventually. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing between several possible things to say and selecting the most accurate one. This is a significant document, he said. The field observations here are tracking something that plant science didn't have adequate tools to quantify until the 1980s. He turned a page. Your grandfather was observing the right variables. He just didn't have the scientific vocabulary for what he was seeing. The vocabulary was there, Rosalind said. It was flavor. Remley looked up. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That's accurate. He looked back at the notebook. He was measuring flavor and translating it into cultivation decisions. He was using sensory data to optimize agricultural outcomes. That is, in fact, what we do now with considerably more expensive equipment. He asked if he could take photographs of specific pages for the research archive. She allowed it. He photographed with the care of someone handling primary source material, which was what it was. In August, the Heartland Seed Conservancy completed their formal documentation and added the variety to the National Heritage Grain Registry. The entry listed origin region as the Ozark Uplands of Missouri Preservation lineage, as the Wexler family of Callaway County, Missouri, and current primary cultivation site as Wexler Farm. It noted in the brief historical section that the variety had been continuously cultivated by the Wexler family since at least the 1930s, with documentation maintained by Virgil Wexler across 4 decades of systematic observation. Rosalind read the entry 3 times. Then she photographed it and sent the image to Letha Crane, who had become something like a witness to the whole arc of what had happened, and who wrote a follow-up piece for the Gazette that was shorter than the first but more specific in its meaning. She sent it also to Dr. Remley, who forwarded it to 3 colleagues. She sent it to Dempsey Pruitt, who wrote back in a single sentence, "Your grandfather should have seen this." She thought about that sentence for several days. The county agricultural fair that fall was held the second weekend of October, as it had been for as long as Rosalind could remember. The fair was the annual accounting of what the land around her had produced, who had done well and who hadn't, what was changing, and what stayed the same year after year. She had walked through it as a child with her parents and as a young farmer with Virgil, and then for many years alone, or with Darla always as a person who was working and trying and not appearing on anyone's recognition lists. She had never minded not being on the lists. She had not been farming for recognition. She had been farming because the farm was hers, and because Virgil had left her something in the soil of the South Slope that she had been slowly learning to understand. This year, the County Agricultural Commissioner announced before reading through the standard recognition categories that a new one had been established. Specialty crops and innovation, he said, looking at his notes. He looked up at the pavilion. The first recipient of this award is Wexler Farm. She walked up to the front of the pavilion. The folding chairs held the county's farming community, the families and the equipment suppliers and the seed dealers and the co-op employees and the neighbors who had farmed the same land for generations, and the newer people who had come in recent years and were still learning what the land required. The faces were familiar. She had known most of them her whole life. She accepted the certificate from the commissioner. She looked out at the people she had known her entire life and thought about what to say that would not embarrass the occasion by being too much and would not waste it by being too little. She saw Orville Odom near the back. He was applauding. Not enthusiastically, but genuinely the applause of a man who has recalibrated something and is doing his honest best with the recalibration. She thought about what Dempsey had said to him in the co-op and what Orville had said back and the expression on Orville's face when he said it, and she understood that Orville Odom was not a villain in any version of this story. He was a man who had used the categories available to him and arrived at the wrong answer by the right method, which is what most people do most of the time. She saw Eldon Mabry in the middle rows, and he was clapping without reservation the way someone claps when they mean it and have no complicated feelings to manage. She saw Arvila Tall in the third row. Arvila gave her a single small nod, the nod of a person who was present at the beginning of something and has now seen how it concludes and is satisfied by the conclusion without needing to say so. She didn't make a long speech. She said, "This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. The third generation didn't understand anything the first generation already knew. All I did was take long enough to learn it." She paused. "I hope everyone here has someone in their past who was patient enough to leave them something worth finding." She walked back to her seat. On the drive home, the October sky was a particular shade of deep, clear blue that Rosalind had noticed her whole life and had never quite been able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. A blue that seemed to come from a great depth and lasted only the 30 or 40 minutes between dusk and dark before deepening into night. She parked in the farm lane and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the engine ticking and the sky doing what it did that time of year at that hour, going through its colors without requiring any response from anyone watching. Through the kitchen window, she could see Darla at the table with her laptop open. Probably the supply schedule for the next delivery, or the correspondence with the Seed Conservancy, or one of the other administrative threads that now required steady management. The kitchen light was warm and ordinary. It was the light of a room where the work had always been done and was being done still. She went inside. On the table beside Darla's things, in the usual accumulation of daily life that collects on kitchen tables, she had arranged 3 things that morning before leaving for the fair. The 6 notebooks stacked in order of their dates, the earliest at the top. The bottle of Pruitt, Tennessee Spirits, small batch reserve, Callaway County, Heritage, corn single origin with about a third remaining. And the formal inquiry letter from the Kentucky distillery received the previous week asking about the possibility of a supply agreement for the following season. She sat down. She poured a small amount from the bottle into a glass and looked at it for a moment in the kitchen light, the amber color of something that had started as corn in a south slope field in Callaway County, Missouri, and had become something else that contained all of that history in the way that made things that had traveled far from their origin still know where they came from. Then she pulled the top notebook from the stack and opened it to the last page Virgil had written anything on. There was a single line in the lower margin, written in ink slightly heavier than the rest of the entry, the ink of someone who was pressing down because they were certain enough to press. Flavor people will remember. She put her hand over the words. The paper was old and smooth warm from being inside the house where it had been kept since he wrote it, the paper of something that had been preserved carefully because the person preserving it understood that careful preservation was itself a form of argument, a way of insisting that a thing had value even when no one around you could see it yet. She held her hand there for a moment and thought about an old man standing in a field on an August evening, holding out an ear of corn to a girl who didn't understand yet why it mattered, and trusting without evidence and without certainty that eventually she would. She thought about all the years between that evening and this one. 12 years of the seed packet in the filing cabinet, 4 years of the south slope field, 6 weeks of waiting for a phone to ring, the whole long patience of it, the sustained and specific attention required to hold on to something that nobody around you has a category for yet. She had not known in any of those years whether any of this would work. She had known only that the thing she was holding on to was real, and that real things, given sufficient time and sufficient fidelity, tend to find their way to the people who understand them. She moved the notebook aside. She pulled the inquiry letter from Kentucky in front of her and opened her own blue notebook to the next clean page. The notebook was the same kind as his. The table was the same table. The kitchen was the same kitchen where she had grown up, where he had sat with his notebooks on winter evenings, working through his observations while she did her homework, on the other end close enough that she could have asked him questions, but usually didn't because she hadn't known yet what the right questions were. She uncapped her pen. She started writing. 3 days after the Star piece ran, the Oregon distillery called a second time. The first call had been brief and exploratory, the kind of call a business makes when it is gathering information before deciding whether to pursue a conversation. The second call was different. The man who called this time identified himself as the head distiller, not the communications office, and he had questions that could only come from someone who had read the agricultural trade publication piece carefully, the one with the longer analysis of heritage grain fermentation chemistry. He asked about the soil profile of the South Slope. He asked about her harvest timing methodology. He asked whether she had observed differences in flavor characteristics between years with different summer rainfall patterns. She answered each question carefully and honestly, including the ones she didn't have complete data on. She said, "I've documented what I've observed, but the range of seasons I have data for is limited." He said he understood that. He asked if she would send him copies of selected pages from the documentation. She said she would consider it. He gave her a direct number and asked her to call when she had decided. She did not call the next day. She wrote his information in the blue notebook under a heading that read simply Oregon, second call. Then she went back to the work of the day, which was planning the spring planting schedule and making sure the seed selection was ready, and she let the Oregon question sit where she had put it. She understood over those weeks that she was in a different position than she had been 6 months earlier, and that this new position required a different kind of attention from the old one. For the contract with the Dempsey, the attention required had been the attention of persistence, the stubborn maintenance of a thing that nobody else was holding. Now the attention required was the attention of judgment. There were more people around the corn now than there had ever been people who wanted pieces of it. In various ways, researchers and journalists and competing distillers and seed archivists, and each of them had a legitimate claim on some part of the story, and none of them had a claim on the corn itself except the one she had given Dempsey and was honoring. The corn was not public. The story of the corn was partly public, which was a different thing, and she was learning to manage that distinction. She talked to Dempsey about the Oregon distillery on his next visit. He was direct about it, which she expected. He said, "You have an exclusive supply contract with me for this variety for 10 years. He said it without heat as a simple statement of what the contract contained. She said she knew that. She said she was asking whether he thought there was any legitimate path to a secondary arrangement that didn't conflict. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'll have my attorney look at the language." She said, "I already looked at the language." She read him the relevant clause. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Call the organ man back." She did. The Oregon distillery became a secondary arrangement, beginning the third year, a smaller volume commitment that occupied the acreage she had added on the north slope beyond what the Pruitt contract required. Dempsey attended the signing call by phone without having been asked to, which she interpreted as his way of marking the boundary rather than enforcing it. She had learned over those years that Dempsey Pruitt was a man who communicated most of what mattered through what he did rather than what he said. The Heartland Seed Conservancy sent a researcher in September, a young woman named Dr. Patricia Vane, who worked in genetic preservation and who was nothing like what Rosalind had expected, which was someone careful and institutional. She was curious and direct and asked questions that showed she had read everything published about the corn and then looked for the things that hadn't been published. She spent a day and a half in the field and 2 hours with the notebooks and an afternoon watching Rosalind select seed for the following year's planting, which she observed from a respectful distance while making quiet notes. At the end of the second day, she said, "I want to tell you something that isn't in the official documentation." Rosalind set down what she was doing and looked at her. "This variety shouldn't have survived," she said. "Genetically, the bottleneck it went through during the decades when very few people were cultivating, it should have compromised its characteristics. It happens to most heritage varieties that drop below a certain cultivation threshold. They survive, but they're diminished." She paused. "This one isn't diminished. Whatever your grandfather was doing when he selected seed every year, he was doing it correctly. He was maintaining genetic integrity through a period when most of these varieties were losing it." Rosalind thought about the 6 notebooks, about the careful notation of which plants had developed differently from their neighbors, about 40 years of selecting the best ears for seed from the plants that showed the characteristics he was looking for, about the fact that he had been doing by intuition and close observation exactly what plant scientists now did with laboratory equipment. He knew the difference, she said, between a plant that was right and one that wasn't. He could see it. Dr. Vane looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think he could." The County Fair Award was in the second week of October. 2 weeks before it, Rosalind received a letter from the Callaway County Historical Society asking whether she would be willing to have copies of the notebooks preserved in their archive. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and went out to the equipment shed and stood there for a few minutes in the familiar cold and the familiar hum of the fluorescent tube. She thought about what it meant for the notebooks to be in an archive. She thought about what it meant for Virgil's work to exist in a place where people could find it for reasons she couldn't predict and couldn't control. She thought about the difference between preservation as a private act, which was what she had been doing for 12 years, and preservation as a public fact, which was what the Historical Society was proposing. She went back inside and wrote a letter that said yes on the condition that the originals remained at the farm. The copies were made the first week of November. The Historical Society sent 2 people who handled the notebooks with the careful attention of people who understood what they were handling, and Rosalind supervised the whole process without interfering. When they left with the copies, she put the originals back on the shelf where she kept them within reach, the same shelf where she could see them from the kitchen table when she was doing the accounts on winter evenings. They had been within reach her whole life. They had been within reach for the 12 years before she understood what they contained. They would stay within reach. That was not going to change. The Fair Awards ceremony was well attended. The pavilion was full in the way it was full on good years when the weather cooperated and the mood of the county was easy. People making time for a thing that was also a good reason to see each other at the end of the growing season. The light in the pavilion was the practical, fluorescent light of a working agricultural space, not flattering but functional, the light of a room that has been hosting the accounting of a county's agricultural year for longer than most people in it could remember. The commissioner introduced the new specialty crops and innovation category with the careful language of an official who is establishing something for the first time and wants the establishment to feel permanent. He explained what the category recognized. He read the recipient's name. Rosalind walked to the front of the room. She shook the commissioner's hand. She took the certificate. She turned to face the people she had known her entire life. She saw Orville Odom near the back, and Eldon Mabry in the middle rows, and Arvilla Tull in the third row. She saw the faces of people who had been at the co-op on the day Orville had made his assessment. She saw people who had not been there, but had heard about it. She saw people who had nothing to do with any of it and who had come to the fair for the same reason they came every year, which was that it was October, and this was what you did in October in Callaway County. She said what she said. She walked back to her seat. Darla touched her arm once lightly without looking at her. Afterward in the parking lot, Arvilla found her while Darla was getting the car. That was the right thing to say, Arvilla said, about having someone patient enough to leave you something worth finding. Rosalind looked at the darkening sky over the fairground. I meant it. I know. Arvilla looked at her for a moment. My mother wasn't patient. She kept the corn out of stubbornness, which is a different thing. She paused, but the result was the same. Rosalind considered this. Stubbornness and patience probably look the same from the outside, she said. Arvilla thought about it. Probably she agreed. They stood together in the parking lot for a moment. The last of the October light was going. Somewhere in the fairground, a generator was running. The air had the smell of fall earth and cold coming. Go home, Arvilla said. You've had a long day. She went home. The week between the county fair and November brought a particular settling of the year's activity, a compressed period when the fields were prepared but not yet resting in earnest, when the cold was serious but not yet the deep cold of December. Rosalind used the time the way she used most transitional periods, which was to think through what had happened and what was coming without yet being required to act on either. She thought about the years of the Corn Project, not as a sequence of events leading inevitably to the current outcome, but as they had actually been experienced, which was as a series of present moments, each one uncertain, each one requiring a decision about whether to continue without knowing whether continuing was the right choice. The outcome didn't retroactively make those years easier than they had been. It didn't transform the co-op visit or the equipment shed evenings or the Prescott-Aldrich conversations into something other than what they had been. What the outcome did was confirm that the thing she had been holding on to was real. The confirmation had arrived at the end. It had not been present for any of the years that required it most. The morning after the county fair, she called Letha Crane. Letha picked up immediately, which was her habit at all hours. I want to do one more conversation, Rosalind said. For the record, not for a story, just for you to have it written down somewhere. Letha was quiet for a moment. What do you want to say? I want to tell you about my grandfather. I want to say what I think he was actually doing in his own language, not the scientific language. She paused. Dr. Remley came and explained it in plant science terms, and those terms are accurate, but they're not what Virgil would have said. Letha came out that afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her pen, and she listened for 2 hours while Rosalind talked. Darla made coffee and then went to do accounts in the other room, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the pen. Rosalind talked about the August evening and the 2 acres of experimental plot and the ear of corn held out by a man who was patient with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be hurried and that being unhurried was its own form of work. She talked about what Virgil had said about flavor being harder to explain to a bank and about what she had understood it to mean at 14 and what she understood it to mean now. She talked about the 12 years the seed had spent in the drawer, which she had not been able to explain to anyone at the time as anything other than reluctance, but which she now understood as a kind of patience she had learned from him without knowing she was learning it. You don't plant the seed until you're ready to commit to what it needs. He would have said something like that if she had asked him directly. She talked about what it had been like to walk through the South Slope field every season for 4 years with the knowledge that what she was growing was genuinely good and no one around her could see why it mattered. The co-op visit, Prescott Aldrich's office, Eldon Mabry at the fence line. She talked about all of it without self-pity and without particular drama, because that was how it had happened quietly over years, and that was how it deserved to be talked about. She was not someone who had been wronged. She was someone who had been carrying something that other people didn't have a category for, and that was a different kind of difficulty, one that didn't require anyone to be the villain. Letha wrote without stopping. She looked up at the end with the expression of a person who has received more than they expected and is still organizing it. Off the record, she said, "Did you ever think about giving up?" Rosalind looked at the notebooks on the shelf. Every evening in the 5th week, she said, "Not before and not after." Letha looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote that down too. Letha did not publish a 3rd article. She put the notes in her files and left them there, which was what Rosalind had wanted. Some things needed to be said for the record without being said for the public, and Letha was a journalist precise enough to understand the difference. The letter from Kentucky arrived on a Thursday, not the initial inquiry which she had received in October, but the follow-up letter, the one that came after she had written back, politely declining to make any commitment before the current season was fully resolved. This letter was more specific. It named a volume a price point above the Prairie contract by a small margin in a term of 5 years beginning with the next harvest. It was signed by the head distiller, not by a business development office, which told her something about how seriously they were taking the approach. She put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for most of the evening. The Prairie contract was exclusive for the South Slope acreage. She had an arrangement with the Oregon distillery for the North Slope extension. Kentucky would require additional acreage that she did not currently have. She had been thinking over the fall about whether there was a natural expansion point. There were 12 acres of adjacent field on the west boundary of the property that had been lying fallow for 3 years, following an inconclusive soil amendment program. The soil there was different from the South Slope, heavier and more acidic, and she didn't yet know whether the variety would perform as well in those conditions or whether the grain characteristics would be comparable. She called Dempsey the next morning. "Kentucky," she said when he answered. "What about them?" She told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment. "I know the operation," he said. "They're legitimate." He was quiet again for a moment in the way of someone running through their own thinking. West Boundary Field. She had told him about it in August in passing when they were walking the North Slope extension. She had not expected him to remember. She acknowledged it. "I'd want to see their grain results before I committed to them as a secondary market," he said. "If the characteristics from the West Field are different from the South Slope, that matters. It matters for us, too, if they're sourcing the same variety under the same story." This was the kind of thinking that had made her trust him. It wasn't possessiveness. It was quality control extended across a shared interest. She said, "I'll ask them to send grain data from comparable plots." He said, "That's right." She wrote to Kentucky and asked for the data. Kentucky sent it within a week, which told her something about how prepared they had been for the question. The data was solid. She sent it to Dempsey. He called her back. "West Boundary Field is your decision," he said. "Your terms, not mine. I just want to know the story is being told consistently." She understood what he meant. The story of the corn is now a product as much as the corn itself. An inconsistency in the story would cost something that was harder to recover than revenue. She understood this, and she thought he was right. She planted 2 acres of the West Boundary Field the following spring as a trial. Not a commitment. A trial documented the same way she documented everything, with observations that went into the blue notebook on the pages after the Oregon arrangement and before whatever came next. The trial results were promising, but different as she had suspected. The Westfield grain had its own character, related, but not identical. She wrote to Kentucky explaining this and including her full field notes from the trial. They wrote back immediately. "Different is not a problem," the letter said. "Different is the story." She thought about that for several days before she responded. In late November, on a Saturday when the work of the week was finished and the farm was in the particular suspended state of a place well prepared for winter, she sat at the kitchen table alone in the afternoon light. Darla had gone to town. The house was quiet, with the specific quality of quiet in a house that is usually occupied, the furniture and the walls familiar, in a way that comfortable spaces become familiar, known without being consciously registered. She had the 6 notebooks and the blue notebook open in front of her. She had been going through them in parallel for the last hour, reading Virgil's entries, and then looking at her corresponding entries from the same seasons, the same slopes, the same variety, observed 40 years apart by 2 people with the same question. What are you actually doing? What is this actually trying to become? His entries were denser, more constrained by the vocabulary available to him, reaching toward things he could see but couldn't quite name. Her entries were more precise in the technical sense, benefiting from everything that had been learned and published in the decades between them. But they were after the same thing. She could see that clearly now, looking at both sets side by side. He had handed her not just the seed, but the question, and the question was the same for both of them. And it was the right question, and it had taken 60 years and 2 people in a distiller from Tennessee driving overnight to arrive at the beginning of an answer. She closed both notebooks. She looked out the window at the south slope field, resting now under the November sky, gray and still and full of whatever the winter was going to need it to be. In the spring, it would need to be a field again, producing what it produced, and she would need to be the person who understood what it was producing and why that mattered, and how to make sure it reached the people who understood the same thing. She was ready for that. She had been getting ready for a long time without knowing that was what she was doing. She made tea. She sat back down at the table. She opened the blue notebook to the current page. She picked up her pen and began to write what she had observed. The following spring, Dr. Remley came back, this time with a graduate student who was writing her dissertation on sensory-based agricultural selection methods. The student, a young woman from Kansas City who was 2 years into her program and had read everything written about the Wexler Farm corn before she arrived, walked the south slope field with the particular focused attention of someone who is seeing the physical reality of a thing she has only encountered in documentation. She stopped in the middle of a row and looked at the nearest stalk for a long time without saying anything. Rosalind watched her from the row's end. The student looked up. She seemed slightly embarrassed at having been caught looking so intently at a stalk of corn. She said, "I'm sorry. I know this must be ordinary to you." Rosalind looked at the row, the stalks in their imperfect heights, the varying ear development, the dark green quality of the leaves in the morning light that she had noticed every summer for 4 years without fully being able to say why she noticed it. "Ordinary," she said. "I don't know if that's the right word." She walked into the row and stood next to the student, and they looked at the plant together for a moment. "What my grandfather was doing," she said, "was paying attention. Every year, 40 years. He was standing in a row like this one and looking at what was in front of him and writing down what he saw." She paused. The science came later and explained why it mattered, but the looking came first. The student wrote this down. Dr. Remley, standing at the row's end with his hands in his pockets, said nothing. He had the expression of a person who has heard something true said simply and is letting it stand on its own. Rosalind walked back and out of the row and went to check on the north slope planting. The morning was clear and cold, and the light on the turned soil was gold in the early angle, the same light that had lit the experimental plot in her dreams and in her memory, the light that this particular slope received in this particular season, and had been receiving for the whole of the time anyone had farmed it. She walked the rows slowly, the way Virgil had walked his rows, not checking, but observing. There was a difference. Checking was a verification process. Observing was something more open, a willingness to see whatever was there, rather than looking for confirmation of what you already expected. He had taught her this without explicitly teaching it, by doing it in front of her until she had seen enough to understand. She had been doing it herself for 4 years on this slope, and for 12 years before that with the seed in the drawer, which was its own form of observation, the watching of a thing that was not yet visible but that you knew was there. She reached the end of the row and stood for a moment looking back the way she'd come. The field ran up to the fence line, and beyond it the equipment shed, and beyond that the house, and beyond that the county road, and beyond that the rest of Callaway County, proceeding through its April morning. The Kentucky arrangement had become formal over the winter. The West Boundary field trial had produced grain that both she and the Kentucky distiller agreed warranted a contract smaller in volume than either of the other two arrangements, but sufficient to justify the acreage and the additional seasonal labor. 3 markets now, 3 different expressions of the same variety from 3 different soil profiles on the same general property, each one developing its own character in the same way that the same seed planted in different ground produces something identifiably the same and also something distinctly itself. She thought Virgil would have found this deeply interesting. Not the commercial success of it, which she thought would have pleased him, but not primarily for the reasons that would please most people. The interesting thing to him would have been the soil variation data. He would have wanted to know whether the sensory profile differences between the 3 plots were consistent across seasons or whether they shifted with rainfall and temperature. He would have wanted a 4th season of data before forming any conclusions. He would have been patient about getting it because he had always understood that the thing you were observing would tell you what it needed to tell you if you paid attention long enough. She went back to the house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the blue notebook and wrote her observations from the morning walk while they were still specific in her mind. The writing had become its own practice, now something she did every day, the way Virgil had done it, morning pages about what she had observed and what she had questions about, and what she would want to verify in the coming days. The blue notebook was three-quarters full. She had another one in the equipment shed cabinet, same brand, same size, ready for when this one was done. She finished her entry and closed the notebook and looked at the six notebooks on the shelf and the blue notebook in front of her on the table and the morning light coming in through the kitchen window across all of it. And she thought, here, this is what was being kept all along. Not the corn exactly, and not the market, and not the contract, and not the award, but this. The continuous close observation of a real thing. The refusal to stop paying attention. The patience to hold it long enough. She stood up. She put her coffee cup in the sink. She went back outside to the work that needed doing.